How's it going, everybody? Welcome to Tombstone's Takes. I'm Tombstone. I'm a librarian who loves to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and interesting about books. And today we have our September wrap-up from what I've read and going into my TBR for October. I've read a number of things in September, mostly good, a little bad, and let's jump right into what I thought about some of these books and what I did read, how far I progressed, where I got to. The first thing that I did is going into September from late August, I had picked up for a reread of Certain Dark Things by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia. It's a fun book about vampires. I talked about it a couple of times this month. If you want to look at the video that I had about books that bring the bite back to vampires, I'll post that up here. I talked about this particular book. It's a fun book that brings the bloodsuckers back. And what's cool about it is that you get Mexican and Aztec vampires. So it's a lot of fun. And it's about Adel, who's a vampire, and she gets caught up in this war between different kinds of vampire gangs and factions in Mexico City. It's a good time. I gave it 3.5 tombstones. And if many of you don't know, 3 tombstones for me is a great, solid, fun book. Oftentimes it's a 5-star or 4-star read for other people. After that, I had the opportunity to read an ARC, an advanced reader copy of the Twyford Code by Janice Hallett. Now, the Twyford Code's kind of hard to explain. It has a different format. The format for the book is that it's transcripts of audio recordings that occurred on an old iPhone 4. And the premise of the book is that Steve Smith has just been released from prison and he's trying to reconnect with his son. And so he's leaving a bunch of voice recordings for his son to listen to, detailing how when he was young, he found a book called Six on Goldtop Hill by Edith Twyford. And the book supposedly contained a code. And this book is an old school tale about secret codes, about maybe potentially having hidden treasure, all that kind of good old adventure story type stuff that you think about with secret codes and books of that nature. I had a fun time reading this book. It was completely awesome. I loved the characters. I loved Steve Smith, or Little Smithy. I loved Lucy the librarian. It was a lot of fun to get into. I give it 4 tombstones. The end and the reveal, as what happens with mystery, got a little tedious. I won't back down from that. That's where most of the deduction for the star comes, or tombstone, 4 tombstones. Anyway, the deduction comes, the reveal was a little tedious, but that happens sometimes in mysteries. People take too long to get to the end. But it's just amazing how Janice Hallett actually created a code in the story, and I'm just in awe of what she did and how clever the book actually was. But for me, it was fun on the sense that it was about a book and an adventure story, and I just ran with it. I felt like a kid again, reading those kinds of adventure books. The third book that I read in September was Black Cherry Blues by James Lee Burke. Those of you who like crime novels and the hard-boiled stuff, if you haven't read this already, you're going to love it. It was written back in 1989, and it won the Edgar Award for the best mystery novel. Those of you who don't know, the Edgar Award is named after Edgar Allan Poe, the man who credited with creating the first detective story. Anyways, Black Cherry Blues is the third book in the Dave Robichaux series. And this one is about Dave. He's reeling from the death of his wife, and he comes across an old friend, not just an old friend, but an old roommate from his college years. And this old roommate kind of drags him into the criminal underworld of Montana. And what ends up happening is that some unsavory types, well, they kill a man and they pin the murder on Dave, and Dave needs to find a way out of it. It's a fantastic book. It's really gritty. Not only is it gritty, but yeah, you can get on the emotional roller coaster reading a James Lee Burke novel. None of the characters in James Lee Burke's stories do smart things, but it's a fun book. You're going to be like, how can Dave just continue to do stupid stuff? And then he has to find his way out of it. But that's part of the fun of a novel, right? So for Black Cherry Blues, I gave that one 4 tombstones as well. Following Black Cherry Blues, I wanted to have some fantasy. It had been a month or two since I read some fantasy. I wanted to get into some good old epic or high fantasy. I can't say that this is an epic fantasy, but I did get into Louise Cooper's The Initiate. Now there's a little bit of a story behind this for me. I first picked up a copy of The Initiate. I think the book was written around 1987, but I purchased it around 1989. I was in high school. I loved all the Robert Gould covers at the time. Robert Gould did covers for Louise Cooper and Michael Moorcock, so all of the Elric stuff had that. All of Michael Moorcock's Count Brass series had Robert Gould covers. Robert Gould covers just had the fantastic art. And so I picked up this book, The Initiate, and I was going to use it we had a free reading session in English, and you'd have 15 minutes to read whatever you wanted. And so one day I picked it up, I started reading it. It was my first day, and on the way out of class, we had 6 periods every day. On the way out of class, the kid who had the locker next to me caught me in the hall and was like, "Hey, I know you always have a book to read, and I forgot to have a book for my free reading session. Can I borrow something?" And I gave him a copy of The Initiate. He said, "I'll have this right back to you after class." And so I was like, "Sure." And I gave him my copy of this brand new book that I had gotten. And he came back after class and he had the book and he gave it back to me. And I was happy to get it back. And then so I started flipping through it because I was kind of uptight about the condition of my book and I wanted it to be perfect and I didn't want any wrinkles in the spine. And I'm flipping through the book and I found that this kid had ripped out the last page of my book. And man, I was heartbroken and angry and upset. And I was like, how would you even do that when I'm doing you a favor? This just isn't cool. How can you do this in polite society? And so I never ended up reading the book. And so now it's however many years later, and I found a copy in a used bookstore not too long ago, and I picked it up and I finally sat down and read it. The book is fun. It's not a perfect book. In fact, the flaws of the book is that it's not longer. It clocks in at under 300 pages. And so what ends up happening is that there are some scenes that we just get told about rather than shown. And if we were shown, it would give us much more of an emotional impact because there would be more opportunity for character development and to understand the nature of some of the tension that Louise Cooper brings to us. I don't know if that's something that Louise Cooper actually had in there and that at the time editors might have edited out of it, but it did bring the story down a little bit. Nevertheless, I had a good time. I suspended my disbelief in some places, and just went with it, and it was a fun tale. The tale centers around a kid who, this kind of, he's not quite an orphan. He's a single family kid. How often does that happen in books? And he accidentally kills his cousin, and as the town are trying to kill him and slay him and bring him to justice, he escapes, and he is found by what's known as the Circle, which are it's kind of the religious hierarchy in this particular world for the gods of order. And as the story progresses, you see how the god of chaos is trying to use this young boy from the single family home to introduce himself back into that world. So it's a fun story. I gave it 3 tombstones, and I'll probably continue on, even though it's not a perfect book. Hopefully I'll find the next one in a used bookstore sometime soon, or I'll have to go searching online and grab a copy and read that. Following the Initiate, what I read, I had a friend contact me who's published by a small press, and I'll have to look it up, and maybe I'll put it in the notes in the description down below. But I was asked to read an arc of a book called Ghosts of Grief Hollow by Sean Burgess. This is a book that is a sequel to a book called The Tear Collector. I read The Tear Collector as well. It's been a couple years since that one's come out. The Tear Collector is about a coming-of-age story for some kids it's a coming-of-age story with some kids, local kids who see some spooky things going on in the woods near their home. And The Ghosts of Grief Hollow is a return to that world, and it's a direct sequel to The Tear Collector. So I don't want to give away too much about the plot of either, because it might spoil some things, and Ghosts of Grief Hollow is coming out on the 18th of October, so I don't want to spoil too much. But needless to say that the book is about these kids and the monsters that are in the woods by their house. And I want to say this, I'm going to give this book 4 stars. Now, this book has some problems with it, and some of the problems include at least one plot point being a red herring, and it also feels a little rushed in the ending for Ghosts of Grief Hollow. I gave 4 stars to The Tear Collector. I didn't feel like The Tear Collector had many red herrings, and I feel like overall it went a little bit better than this book. However, the strengths of this book overcome some of the flaws of that. And what I mean is, this book knows it's a horror story. This book wants to cater to horror fans. This book wants to show you the monsters. It wants to show you the grisly deaths. It wants you to have fun with it. It knows exactly what it is, and it doesn't hold back on that. And it does something really well that horror doesn't do very well these days. And that's this. Everybody is on the table to potentially die. Everybody. And that's one of the things that horror these days has been getting away from, is that you're not scared for certain characters. If you've got a main character, oftentimes you know that they're going to be protected. You know that something's not going to happen to them. And so it impacts how much tension you can actually have, and you're not actually scared if you know that people are going to be protected. And that's a big problem with a lot of things in horror, whether it's books or movie or television these days. And this book knows that you've got to be able to kill anybody at any time, and that's fantastic. And I loved it for that. And it was fast-paced and moving in a way that books about monsters should. Yeah, and the last book that I read in September was the novella This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. People have been talking about this for a few years now. In fact, I've heard people raving about it. They've absolutely loved this book. It's about a couple of soldiers in different factions of agencies that are trying to destroy time. These two agents start writing letters to each other and they fall in love. And in the end, this book is exactly how I lost the time war. That's however much time in my life that I'm not going to get back because I chose to read this book and it was such a mess. I give it 1 tombstone. We don't know why the agencies were having a time war. You don't know what it is that these two agents loved about each other. They don't actually interact with each other. They just start writing to each other, and the next thing you know, they're telling each other that they're in love. And it's like, okay, well, you love this person because they wrote you a note? Yeah, that's the book. Two people write each other a note. Oh, and it's not really about time so much as it's about multi-universes or multiverses or alternate universes, parallel universe, however you want to call it. And there wasn't really any, So they might be in a different time in another universe, but it wasn't them like really going back and forth in time. And they write each other notes and they say they love each other. Okay, so what am I reading for October? It's October, it's fall time, it's pumpkin time, it's jack-o'-lantern time, it's leaves turning red and gold and falling to the ground, and time for trick-or-treating and costumes and having fun and loving every minute of it. It's my favorite time of year, and so I have to get back into some of maybe not necessarily just horror books, but maybe some ghost stories and skeleton stories and creature stories and all that other stuff that comes with Halloween. I love it. It's my favorite. And so I only have 3 books that are planned because I'm very much a mood reader. And so I want to make sure that I have things that are open for the spontaneous reads that I want to get to right at the time. So let me talk a little bit about what I've got on the plan that I plan to get through for the month. The first thing that I plan to get through is how perfect that this coincided with the right time. But Grady Hendrix, who did We Sold Our Souls, Horror Store, My Best Friend's Exorcism, The Vampire's Guide to Slaying, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and others. Grady Hendrix, he's coming out with a new book in January, I think, and I happened to get my hands on an arc called How to Sell a Haunted House, and I'm excited to read this. It's about Mark and Louise Louise travels home when her parents die in an accident, and she's fighting with Mark about how to deal with the family's estate, and it turns out that their parents' home is haunted. I'm looking forward to this. I hope it's as fun as it sounds. Grady Hendrix deserves a lot of praise. I know he's kind of one of the darlings in the horror world right now, but that's because he knows how to make a fun book. He doesn't do anything too excessively, and he just writes a good, fun book, and so I'm looking forward to this one. I'm starting it, a few pages in. I hope I love it. It's going well so far. The next book that I'm going to read is an older book. It's one that I haven't picked up for quite a while, and I don't remember very much about it. And that's called A Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny. I know a lot of people love to read that book around Halloween. It's got a lot going on. The book, I do remember, is almost like epistolary in format, and each of the chapters or whatnot, chapters goes by each day in October, and there are the elder gods and, like from the Cthulhu mythos and Jack the Ripper and all kinds of craziness. I think there's everything that you could smush into Halloween into one book, and it's all in there. And then after that, I am going to read Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. I haven't read this one yet by him. I've read a few of his books, but I haven't read this one. I'm going to read that one. That one's a coming-of-age tale. People call it Dan Simmons' It, because there's a group of 6 boys or whatnot riding around on their bikes having a coming-of-age tale as they fight evil in their town. I trust Dan Simmons to give me a good tale. So those are the books that I'm going to read. What are you going to read this October? I'm going to tell you this too. Some things that might slow me down. If I just get the hankering to read a ghost story or a zombie story or a werewolf story, I love October shorts. This is a great time to get in with all of the great horror authors who have written short stories in the past. I don't feel like short stories get enough love on YouTube or BookTube, but horror stories, man, there's a great place to have a really condensed tale and give you a scare really quickly, because sometimes that's what you need, is you need the quick scare and not something that's long and drawn out and doesn't get to where you need to be fast enough. So I'm going to read a bunch of those, and I'll probably even make a few videos of them. So that's what I'm going to read. Tell me what you're going to read. Also, tell me if you'd read any of those books that I read in September. What'd you think of them? How'd you like them? Tell me all that stuff. Leave them in the comment below. This has been Tombstone's Takes. This is my September wrap-up and my October TBR. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.